The Supreme Court chamber fell into stunned silence. Chief Justice John Roberts had just said something that would change American politics forever. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium, her eyes blazing with a fire that promised justice was coming. What happened in the next 30 seconds which shocked the entire nation and exposed the ugly truth about power in America? Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss moments like this when justice finally comes for those who think they are untouchable. Now let's see how one woman's response brought down the most powerful judge in America. It started as a routine Supreme Court hearing. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas had come to testify about voting rights legislation. She walked into that marble chamber wearing a sharp navy blazer, her natural hairstyle, proudly carrying a folder of evidence that would soon make history. She had no idea that Chief Justice Roberts was about to reveal his true colors in the most shocking way possible. The morning of the hearing, Crockett had woken up at 5 o'clock a.m. in her Washington hotel room, going over her notes one final time. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, "Baby, when they try to tear you down, you stand taller." She had prepared for legal challenges, constitutional arguments, even political theater, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold. As she entered the Supreme Court building, tourists and court watchers lined the hallways. Some recognized her and whispered excitedly. Others looked at her with curiosity, wondering who this young black woman was walking so confidently through the halls of power. Little did they know they were witnessing someone about to make history. The security guards of the metal detectors treated her with the usual mix of respect and suspicion that powerful black women know all too well. One guard looked at her ID twice as if he couldn't believe a congresswoman could look like her. But Crockett was used to this treatment. It only strengthened her resolve. The tension in the room was already thick. This wasn't just any hearing. This was about the future democracy in America. Robert sat behind his massive bench, looking down at Crockett with barely concealed disdain. His colleague shifted uncomfortably as Crockett began presenting her case with the precision of a lawyer. She was before entering Congress. The marble walls of the Supreme Court seemed to close in as a weight of history pressed down on everyone present. This chamber had witnessed some of the most important moments in American jurisprudence: Brown versus Board, Roe versus Wade, Citizens United. But nobody in that room could have predicted they were about to witness something that would overshadow them all. Roberts had clearly come into this hearing with an agenda. Sources later revealed that he had spent the previous evening in his chambers pacing back and forth, muttering about activists and troublemakers. His law clerks had never seen him so agitated about a simple congressional testimony. One clerk would later tell reporters that Roberts had said, "It's time someone put these people in their place." The Chief Justice's usual mass of judicial temperance was already slipping before Crockett even began speaking. His fingers drummed impatiently on the bench. His jaw was clenched tight. Justice Ginsburg, if she had still been alive, would have recognized the signs immediately. This was a man on the edge of an explosion. But Roberts had already made up his mind. What came out of his mouth next would expose decades of hidden racism at the highest levels of American government. The words that followed would echo through history and prove that even the Chief Justice of the United States wasn't above showing his true face when challenged by a brilliant black woman who refused to back down. As Crockett approached the podium, she could feel the weight of every ancestor who had fought for her right to be in that room. Her great-great-grandmother had been born into slavery. Her great-grandmother had fought for the right to vote. Her grandmother had integrated lunch counters in the South. And now here she was about to face down the most powerful judge in America. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a descendant of enslaved people, standing in a building constructed partly by enslaved labor, about to be attacked by a man whose family had perpetuated the very racism she was fighting against. But instead of intimidating her, the historical weight of the moment gave her strength. She had prepared for this moment her entire life. Even if she didn't know it. Every racist teacher who had underestimated her. Every judge who had looked at her with condescension. Every opponent who had tried to silence her voice. They had all prepared her for this confrontation with the Chief Justice of the United States. To understand the explosive confrontation that was about to unfold, you need to know exactly who these two people are and why this moment mattered so much to millions of Americans. Chief Justice John Roberts has sat on the Supreme Court for nearly 2 decades. At 69 years old, he's been the face of conservative judicial power, making decisions that affect every American's life. He is known for his calm demeanor and careful words, at least in public. Behind closed doors, sources are whispered about a different side of Roberts. One that reveals itself when he thinks nobody important is watching. Roberts grew up in elite circles in Buffalo, New York. The son of a steel plant manager who worked his way into the middle class. But John Roberts wanted more than middle class. He went to Harvard Law School, clerk for the most powerful judges, and climbed the ladder of power with ruthless ambition. By the time he reached the Supreme Court, he had learned to hide his true feelings behind the mask of judicial propriety. Former colleagues have described Roberts as someone who was always conscious of status and hierarchy. A former law clerk speaking anonymously years later would say, he treated people differently based on their background. If you went to the right schools, came from the right family, he respected you. If not, the clerk's voice would trail off, the implication clear. Roberts will spend his entire career in the halls of power, surrounded by people who look like him, think like him, and never challenge his worldview. He's used to being the smartest person in the room. Used to having his word be final. He has never been seriously challenged by someone like Jasmine Crockett. Someone who didn't need his approval or fear his power. On the other side stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a 43-year-old powerhouse from Dallas, Texas. Before entering Congress, she was a civil rights attorney who fought in the trenches for justice. She didn't grow up with privilege. She earned everything through hard work and brilliance. Her grandmother used to tell her, "Baby, they can try to break your spirit, but they can never break your truth." Crockett's journey to that Supreme Court chamber had been anything but easy. Born to a single mother in South Dallas, she watched her mom work 3 jobs to keep their family afloat. Her mother cleaned offices at night, worked retail during the day, and took in laundry on weekends. Education is your way out, her mother would say. Even when the electricity got cut off because it couldn't pay the bill, Crockett earned a full scholarship to the University of Texas. Then went to law school while working part-time jobs to survive. She could have taken a high-paying corporate job after graduation. But instead she chose to represent people who couldn't afford fancy lawyers. For 15 years she fought police brutality cases, housing discrimination lawsuits, and voting rights violations. She remembers the first time she walked into a courtroom as a young lawyer. The older white judge looked at her with barely concealed disdain. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" he had asked. That day she learned that no matter how smart she was, how hard she worked, or how much she achieved, some people would always see her as someone who didn't belong. But instead of breaking her, those experiences made her stronger. Every racist's comment, every condescending look, every attempt to diminish her only fueled her determination to fight harder. By the time she reached Congress, she had developed an unshakable confidence and a razor-sharp ability to dismantle opponents with facts and truth. Crockett had come to Congress with one mission: to protect voting rights for all Americans. She'd seen firsthand how the system tried to silence voices like hers. But unlike other politicians who play it safe, Crockett speaks truth to power no matter who's listening. That fearlessness was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This hearing was about the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, legislation that would restore protections for minority voters across America. Millions of people were counting on Crockett to fight for their voices. She knew that powerful people would try to stop her. But she never imagined a Chief Justice himself would reveal his true feelings in such a shocking way. The Supreme Court chamber represents the highest ideals of American justice. Equal treatment under law. Dignity for all citizens. The promise that in America truth matters more than power. What was about to happen would shatter those ideals and show the world that even in the most sacred halls of justice, racism still lurks in shadows, waiting to emerge when the wrong person gets too comfortable. The hearing began normally enough. Crockett approached the podium with confidence. Her prepared remarks focus on the urgent need to protect voting rights. She had spent weeks preparing, knowing that every word would be scrutinized. What she didn't know was that Roberts had already decided to make this personal. Chief Justice Roberts, members of the court, Crockett began, her voice clear and strong. I come before you today not just as a member of Congress but as someone who has witnessed firsthand the systematic attempts to disenfranchise American citizens. Roberts leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Even from the beginning something felt off. The other justices noticed it too. The way Robert was looking at Crockett wasn't the usual judicial detachment. There was something else there. Something ugly. As Crockett continued a presentation laying out case after case of voter suppression, Robert began interrupting more frequently than usual. Congresswoman, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Are you suggesting this court doesn't understand the Constitution? Crockett didn't flinch. Chief Justice, I'm suggesting that constitutional principles mean nothing if we don't protect the right of every American to vote. The temperature in the room seemed to rise. Robert's face was getting red, his usual composed mask starting to slip. Justice Clarence Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Justice Elena Kagan watched with growing concern, as Robert's questions became increasingly hostile. Perhaps, Roberts said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, you should focus on representing your actual constituents instead of grandstanding for the cameras. The insult was clear, but Crockett held her ground. Chief Justice, my constituents are American citizens whose voices have been silenced. That's exactly why I'm here. What happened next shocked everyone in the chamber. Robert slammed his gavel down harder than necessary, the sound echoing through the marble halls like a gunshot. Congresswoman Crockett, he said, his voice now openly hostile. Your theatrics might work in the circus of Congress, but this is a Supreme Court. The words hit like a slap. Calling Congress a circus was bad enough, but the way Robert said it with such venom and contempt made it clear this was personal. The other justices shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Justice Breyer looked shocked. Justice Kagan's eyes went wide with disbelief. In the gallery, people began whispering. This wasn't normal judicial behavior. Chief Justices don't lose a temper like this, especially not at congressional witnesses. Something was very wrong and everyone could feel it. But what made the moment even more explosive was what Roberts did next. He stood up from his chair, something Chief Justices almost never do during testimony, and pointed directly at Crockett. The gesture was aggressive, intimidating, designed to make her feel small and powerless. Some people, Roberts continued, his voice dripping with disdain, seem to think they can come into my courtroom and lecture me about the Constitution. The emphasis on my and me was unmistakable. This wasn't about legal procedure or constitutional law. This was about power. About a white man in authority being challenged by a black woman who refused to show the difference he expected. The other justices were now visibly uncomfortable. This wasn't normal judicial behavior. Roberts was losing control, and everyone could see it. Justice Thomas was shaking his head in disbelief. Justice Barrett had gone pale. Even the conservative justices who usually supported Roberts looked mortified by his behavior. But Crockett wasn't backing down. She'd faced down racist judges before, and she wasn't about to let even the Chief Justice intimidate her. If anything, his obvious hostility was energizing her. She could feel the strength of her ancestors flowing through her, or the people who had fought and died for her right to stand in that chamber. Chief Justice, she responded, her voice steadied despite the obvious disrespect. Protecting voting rights isn't theatrics. It's constitutional duty. That's when Roberts made his first major mistake. Standing up from his chair, pointing directly at Crockett, he said loudly enough for the entire chamber to hear. Don't lecture me about constitutional duty, Congresswoman. Some of us actually understand what American values mean. The implications were clear. The some of us versus you people message wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Roberts had just divided the chamber into us white established legitimate Americans and people like Crockett who he clearly didn't consider real Americans. The court stenographer actually stopped typing for a moment, unsure if she should record such obviously inappropriate comments. The bailiffs looked at each other nervously. They had never seen anything like this in decades of court service. But Crockett had dealt with coded racism her entire career. She knew exactly what Roberts was really saying. And she wasn't going to let it slide. Chief Justice, she replied, her voice growing stronger. American values include equality under law for all citizens regardless of race or background. Roberts's face went from red to purple. The mask was completely off now. Just as Sonia Sotomayor actually gasped audibly. Just as Amy Coney Barrett looked mortified. They all knew something terrible was about to happen, but none of them could stop it. In the gallery, people were pulling out their phones, sensing that history was about to be made. Court security moved nervously, unsure whether they should confiscate the devices or let this moment be recorded for posterity. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Robert stood there for a moment, swaying slightly. His hands gripping the bench so hard his knuckles had turned white. The other justices watched in horror as they achieved justice, prepared to destroy not just his own career but potentially the reputation of the entire Supreme Court. Justice Thomas later said it was like watching a man jump off a cliff in slow motion. Congresswoman Roberts said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in a court system that shares your perspective. The pause before perspective was loaded with meaning. Everyone in the chamber knew what he was really saying. The dog whistle was so loud it might as well have been a foghorn. But Roberts wasn't done. He was about to cross a line that would shock the entire nation and destroy his own reputation forever. The bailiffs looked confused. Court reporters stopped typing, unsure they should record what was happening. The other justices sat frozen, watching their Chief Justice about to commit career suicide in the most public way possible. Justice Elena Kagan was frantically scribbling notes, trying to document what she was witnessing. Justice Neil Gorsuch had gone completely pale, realizing that his mentor and the man who had recommended him for the court was about to destroy everything they had built. Justice Kavanaugh kept looking around the room as if searching for an exit from this nightmare. The court's stenographer, a 30-year veteran who had recorded thousands of hours of Supreme Court proceedings, would later say she had never seen anything like it. I've transcribed arguments about life and death, freedom and slavery, war and peace, she told reporters. But I've never seen a Chief Justice lose his mind in real time. In the gallery, members of the press were frantically texting their editors. CNN Supreme Court correspondent was already drafting breaking news alerts. The C-SPAN cameras captured every moment, broadcasting this historic meltdown to millions of Americans who couldn't believe what they were seeing. Crockett stood toward the podium, her folder of evidence still in her hands, completely calm despite the storm of racism being directed at her. She had prepared for legal arguments, constitutional debates, even political attacks, but she was about to face something else entirely. The raw, unfiltered prejudice of one of the most powerful men in America. What she didn't know was that a calm demeanor was driving Robert even more insane. He had expected her to cower, to apologize, to show the difference that he believed was his due. Instead, she stood there like a queen, unbowed and unafraid. Her composure was a direct challenge to everything he believed about power and hierarchy in America. The contrast between them was striking and symbolic. Roberts, red-faced and trembling with rage, represented the old America. The America where white men in power expected automatic respect and submission. Crockett, calm and dignified, represented the new America. The America where respect had to be owned, not demanded. And where truth mattered more than tradition. The cameras captured it all. This wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. This was a moment that would define the soul of American democracy. What happened next will be talked about for generations. Chief Justice John Roberts, the man who was supposed to represent the highest ideals of American justice, looked directly at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and said the words that would end his career and shock the entire world. Congresswoman Crockett, Roberts said, his voice now dripping with venom. If you don't like how we do things in America, maybe you should go back to Africa where you came from. The Supreme Court chamber exploded into chaos. Justice Kagan actually stood up from her chair. Justice Breyer's mouth fell open in shock. Even Justice Thomas looked horrified. The court reporters stopped typing, unsure if they had heard correctly. The bailiffs looked at each other, not knowing what to do when the Chief Justice himself had just committed what might be the most racist act in Supreme Court history. But in that moment of absolute chaos, one person remained completely calm. Jasmine Crockett stood at that podium, looked directly at John Roberts and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, it was a smile of someone who had just been handed the ammunition she needed to change everything. Chief Justice Roberts, Crockett said, her voice cutting through the chaos. I need to make sure I heard you correctly. Did you just tell a sitting member of Congress to go back to Africa? Roberts realized what he had done, but it was too late. The words were out. Recorded by court reporters. Witnessed by 8 other Supreme Court justices and dozens of others in chamber. His face went white as he understood the magnitude of his mistake. That's not what Roberts stammered, but Crockett cut him off. No, Chief Justice. Let's be very clear about what just happened here. In front of the highest court in the land. You just told a black woman, a sitting member of Congress, to go back to Africa. Is that correct? The silence in the chamber was deafening. Robert sat down heavily, his hands shaking. He had just destroyed everything he had built over decades of carefully crafted public image. But Crockett wasn't done. Chief Justice, she said as her voice grew stronger with each word. My family has been in America for over 200 years. My ancestors built this country with their blood, sweat, and tears. They were here before your family came from Ireland. So when you tell me to go back to Africa, what you're really saying is that in your mind I don't belong in America. Justice Sotomayor was now openly crying. Justice Kagan had her head in her hands. The other justices sat in stunned silence, as Crockett delivered what would become one of the most powerful speeches in American political history. But here's what's really interesting. Chief Justice Robert Crockett said, pulling out a document from her folder. While you're telling me to go back to Africa, I've been investigating your family's background. Would you like to know what I found? Roberts looked terrified. Crockett smiled again. That same dangerous smile. Your great-grandfather Patrick Roberts came to America from County Cork, Ireland in 1887. He was fleeing poverty and discrimination. Sound familiar? When he arrived at Ellis Island, the immigration officer couldn't pronounce his original Irish name, so they changed it to Roberts. Your family came here looking for the same thing every immigrant family looks for: opportunity, safety, and a chance at a better life. The chamber was so quiet. You could hear pin drop. Crockett was systematically dismantling Roberts with facts, turning his own racist attack against him. But here's the really interesting part. Crockett continued, her voice rising. In 1924, your grandfather was arrested for participating in an anti-black riot in Chicago. There's a police report. Would you like me to read it? Roberts looked like he was going to be sick. The other justices were staring at him in horror. The man they had worked with for years had just been exposed as someone whose family had a history of exactly the kind of racism he had just displayed. The report says Patrick Roberts Jr. was arrested for participating in violent acts against Negro residents. He spent 3 days in jail. Your grandfather, Chief Justice Roberts, was literally a documented racist who attacked black Americans. And now here you are telling me to go back to Africa. Crockett let that sink in for a moment before delivering the knockout blow. Chief Justice, if we're going to start telling people to go back where they came from based on their family's behavior, maybe you should go back to Ireland. At least my ancestors built this country. You tried to destroy it with hatred and violence. The chamber erupted. Someone started clapping. Then others joined in. Within seconds, half the chamber was on their feet applauding Jasmine Crockett as she stood toward that podium, having just delivered the most devastating political response in modern American history. Robert sat slumped in his chair, completely defeated. His racist attack had backfired spectacularly. Instead of silencing Crockett, he had given her the platform to expose not just his racism, but his family's history of it. The Chief Justice of the United States had just been destroyed by the very woman he thought he could intimidate. But Crockett wasn't finished. Chief Justice, she said as the applause died down. You ask me about American values. Let me tell you what American values really are. They are about a country where a black woman whose ancestors were enslaved can stand in the highest court in the land and speak truth to power. They are about a nation where justice isn't determined by the color of your skin or where your family came from. They are about the idea that in America, truth matters more than power. She paused. looking directly at Roberts, who couldn't meet her eyes. But most importantly, American values are about the understanding that this country belongs to all of us. Not just the people who look like you, Chief Justice. All of us. And no amount of racism, no matter how high the office it comes from, will ever change that truth. The standing ovation that followed lasted for 5 full minutes. Even some of the other justices were clapping. Roberts sat alone at the bench, isolated and humiliated, his career in ruins. In trying to put Jasmine Crockett in her place, he had instead shown the entire world exactly what kind of man he really was. The fallout from Chief Justice Roberts' racist attack and Jasmine Crockett's devastating response was immediate and massive. Within minutes of the hearing ending, videos of the exchange were flooding social media. By that evening, #Roberts Races and #Crockett Truth were both trending worldwide. The political earthquake that followed would reshape American politics and expose the deep rut that had been hiding in the highest levels of government for decades. The first major reaction came from President Biden himself. Within 2 hours of the incident, he released a statement that sent shockwaves through Washington. Chief Justice Roberts' racist comments toward Congresswoman Crockett are completely unacceptable and have no place in American government. I am calling for his immediate resignation. But that was just the beginning. Congressional Democrats led by Speaker Hakeem Jeff announced they will be filing impeachment articles against Roberts. No one, not even the Chief Justice, is above accountability for racist behavior, Jeff declared at a packed press conference. The Supreme Court itself was in chaos. Justice Alan Kagan released an unprecedented statement. I am horrified and ashamed by the Chief Justice's comments. They do not represent the values of this court or this nation. One by one, the other justices began distancing themselves from Roberts. Even conservative justices couldn't defend what they had witnessed. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, in a rare public statement, said racism has no place on the Supreme Court or anywhere in American government. Justice Neil Gorsuch called Roberts' comments indefensible. But the most surprising reaction came from Justice Clarence Thomas, who had been silent on racial issues for decades. In an emotional statement, Thomas said, I have served on this court for over 30 years. And I have never been more ashamed of a colleague. Chief Justice Roberts' racism is exactly what I have fought against my entire career. The legal community was in uproar. Law school deans across the country issued joint statements condemning Roberts. The American Bar Association, which had previously endorsed Roberts, called for an investigation. Hundreds of federal judges signed a letter demanding his resignation. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett was being hailed as a hero across America and around the world. Her calm, fact-based dismantling of Roberts' racism had shown the world what real leadership looked like. Messages of support poured in from celebrities, politicians, and ordinary citizens who had watched her stand up to the most powerful judge in America. Oprah Winfrey tweeted, Jasmine Crockett showed us what courage looks like. She turned a moment of hate into a lesson in truth. Barack Obama called her an inspiration to everyone who believes in justice. Even international leaders weighed in, with the Prime Minister of Canada calling her response a masterclass in dignity and strength. The investigation into Roberts' background at Crockett had reference revealed even more disturbing details. Journalists discovered that Roberts' law firm had represented several companies with histories of racial discrimination. His judicial decisions were re-examined, revealing a pattern of rulings that consistently harm minority communities. A team of investigative reporters from The Washington Post spent weeks digging into Roberts' past. What they found was shocking. Court documents from the 1990s showed that Roberts had personally argued cases defending companies that were accused of racial discrimination. In one case, he had argued that a company that refused to hire black employees was within its rights because cultural fit was a legitimate hiring criterion. Even more damaging, they discovered emails from Roberts' time in the Reagan Justice Department, where he had argued against expanding the Voting Rights Act. In one particularly shocking email, Roberts had written, "The Constitution doesn't guarantee anyone the right to vote in a language other than English." In another, he had suggested that certain districts should be redrawn to limit the influence of undesirable elements. The most damaging discovery came from Roberts' college years at Harvard. His senior thesis, which had been sealed for decades, was finally leaked to the press. In it, Roberts had argued that certain populations were not capable of full participation in democratic governance, and that intellectual differences between racial groups should be considered in policym. Most damaging of all, former clerk began speaking out about Roberts' private comments over the years. A former clerk speaking anonymously told the Washington Post, "He always seemed uncomfortable around people of color. He would make comments that we thought were just old-fashioned, but now we realize they were actually racist." Another former clerk revealed that Roberts had a habit of referring to black defendants as those people, and had once said that some cultures just don't value education the way we do. The clerk had been so disturbed by the comments that they had kept detailed notes which they now turned over to investigators. The calls for Roberts' resignation became a raw protest erupted outside the Supreme Court with thousands of Americans demanding justice. The #ResignRoberts became the most used hashtag in Twitter history. Even traditionally conservative media outlets began calling for his removal. Fox News host Tucker Carlson, not known for supporting Democrats, shocked his audience by saying, "What Roberts said was indefensible. Jasmine Crockett handled it better than he deserved." The Wall Street Journal editorial board wrote, "Chief Justice Roberts has lost the moral authority to lead the Supreme Court." As the pressure mounted, Roberts tried to control the damage. He released a statement saying his comments were taken out of context and that he regretted any misunderstanding. But the American people weren't buying it. Video of the incident had been viewed over 100 million times. And there was no way to spin what everyone had seen with their own eyes. Congressional Republicans found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't defend Roberts' comments, but they also didn't want to lose a conservative voice on the court. Senator Mitch McConnell, in a carefully worded statement, said, "The Chief Justice's comments were inappropriate, but we should focus on moving forward." But the American people weren't interested in moving forward without accountability. Polling showed that 78% of Americans, including 45% of Republicans, believed Roberts should resign. The pressure was becoming unbearable. 2 weeks after the incident, more devastating news broke. The New York Times revealed that Roberts had used racial slurs in private conversations with other judges as recently as 2019. 3 different sources confirmed that Roberts had referred to black defendants using the N-word during private discussions about cases. That revelation was a final straw. Even Roberts' strongest supporters could no longer defend him. Senate Republican leader McConnell issued a new statement. Chief Justice Roberts can no longer effectively serve in his position. For the good of the court and the country, he should step down. On a Friday evening, exactly 3 weeks after his confrontation with Jasmine Crockett, John Roberts announced his resignation from the Supreme Court in a brief letter. He wrote, "I can no longer effectively serve as Chief Justice. I am resigning immediately." But Roberts' resignation was only part of the story. Jasmine Crockett had become a national figure, with speculation mounting about her political future. Time magazine put her on their cover with a headline, "The Voice of a New Generation." Books deals, speaking engagements, and even presidential speculation followed. More importantly, Crockett used a newfound platform to push for real change. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which had been stored in Congress, suddenly had new momentum. Public support for the legislation skyrocketed after Americans saw how racist attitudes were still infecting the highest levels of government. The impact extended far beyond politics. Corporate America took notice. Companies that had been silent on racial issues suddenly felt pressure to speak out. The Roberts incident became a watershed moment, forcing institutions across America to examine their own practices and leadership. Law schools began requiring courses on bias and racism. The American Bar Association implemented new ethics rules specifically addressing racist behavior by attorneys and judges. The entire legal profession was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about systemic racism. International reaction was swift and severe. America's allies expressed shock and concern about the state of American democracy. The European Union issued a statement expressing deep concern about racism in the highest levels of the American government. China and Russia used the incident to criticize American leadership on human rights issues. But perhaps the most important impact was on ordinary Americans, especially young people and people of color. Jasmine Crockett had shown them that it was possible to stand up to power, to speak truth even to the most powerful people in the country. Her example inspired a new generation of activists and leaders. Schools across America began teaching about the Roberts-Crockett confrontation as an example of how one person can make a difference. Crockett's response became required reading in civics classes. Her words, "American values are about the understanding that this country belongs to all of us," were quoted in graduation speeches and carved into monuments. The Supreme Court itself was forever changed. Roberts's replacement, nominated by President Biden and confirmed by the Senate, was a black woman who specifically cited Crockett's courage as an inspiration. The court implemented new ethics rules and diversity training for all justices and staff. 1 year later, Jasmine Crockett was named Times Person of the Year. In her acceptance speech she said, "I didn't set out to change history that day. I just set out to tell the truth. But that's what truth does. It changes everything." Looking back, historians would mark the Roberts-Crockett confrontation as a turning point in American history. It was a moment when the country was forced to confront the racism that still existed in its highest institutions. It was a moment when a young black congresswoman showed the world that courage and truth could triumph over power and prejudice. The lesson for all Americans was clear. No one, no matter how powerful, is above accountability. And sometimes it takes just one person willing to speak truth to power to change everything. Chief Justice John Roberts had tried to put Jasmine Crockett in her place. Instead, she had shown him and the entire world exactly where he belonged. In the dustbin of history alongside every other races who thought they could silence the voices of justice and truth. The story of that day will be told for generations. The day achieved justice, revealed his true colors, and a congresswoman showed America what real leadership looks like. It was a day that proved once again that in America truth will always triumph over hate. Thanks for watching this incredible story of courage and justice. If you want to see more stories of people standing up to power and fighting for what's right, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Your support helps us bring you the stories that matter most. What did you think of Jasmine Crockett's response? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to share this video with everyone who needs to see what real courage looks like.